So yes, the title of my talk is New Forms of Scholarly Communications, Opportunities and Challenges. So this might be people in the audience here today engaging with lots of different ways of communicating their research through social media platforms, putting many different kinds of resources out into the public, throwing off a kind of miasma perhaps of ideas and resources and content which anybody with access to the internet can find and make use of. I don't know whether this is anybody here today, but this potentially is what is available for people now in terms of new forms of ways of communicating one's research. Actually, that slide's a couple of years old, so you probably note a few obvious missing platforms that are now freely and widely available. So let me first of all give some background to this talk. So the scholarly community is experiencing perhaps the most profound changes in how it communicates its work since what Chapin calls virtual witnessing and the establishing of the parameters, the template for conventions for writing scholarly papers. So we can see these changes evident both in the ways in which scholars communicate within their communities, but also how they communicate beyond with funders and indeed with the public at large. And these changes are taking place in the context of a number of different external pressures. Scholars are encouraged to communicate their findings more quickly, to do their research faster and produce more robust findings, to improve the transfer of scientific knowledge into the wider community, into the economy, to generate more impact, of course, and to make the scholarly community more accountable to the society at large. And in parallel with that, if that wasn't enough, of course, individual members have an enduring concern to establish their reputations and to build credit, which can be measured and will feed into yet another cycle of research evaluation. And of course, there are, rather fortuitously, coincidentally, a raft of innovations in technologies which promise new platforms for conducting scholarly communications and for interacting both within the community and outside it, and new ways of exchanging scientific ideas and knowledge. And of course, as far as accountability is concerned, we should remember that controversy has become quite a common feature in some fields. So scientists have been accused of lack of accountability over ClimateGate, of hiding data from others so that their particular point of view will receive perhaps more credibility than it deserves. And then we've got, perhaps inspired by such controversies over accountability, arguments that science should become truly open. We should move into a world of Science 2.0 where everything is freely available to whoever might want to use it. Now, I became interested in this area when 2 or 3 years ago we did some work for the Research Information Network looking at patterns of adoption of new forms of scholarly communications. By survey and by interviews, we collected information, data about people's attitudes towards new forms of scholarly communications, the issues that they had with it, and whether they thought it would be likely to become something important in the future. On the whole, and these results are a couple of years old or so, our findings were that only a small number of those we surveyed and those we talked to are genuinely involved in using blogs and other social media in order to publish their research in more timely and rapid ways. And indeed, the early adopters are not the usual suspects. There was a feeling that it's the F generation that is really driving this, the Facebook generation, but in fact, amongst our respondents at least, it tends to be older scholars rather than younger ones. A lot of people are quite critical about the use of new forms of scholarly communications and changing the way that publishing is done, and perhaps obviating the need for a peer review. They complained about it being unscientific and possibly dangerous, or a waste of time, lack of quality control, lack of understanding of the benefits, and so forth, were all cited by those people who were quizzical, to say the least, about what the value might be. This is just a summary of some of the quantitative data, the survey data. So classifying users by whether they're frequent or occasional or non-users of new forms of scholarly communications. On the one hand, I see most people consider themselves to be occasional or non-users. If we look at the distribution over people's career positions, PhD student, research fellow, up to professor, we see that there's not much evidence that it's been driven by younger scholars. And if we look at, again, different types of embracing of scholarly communications, ranging from social networkers who use Twitter to talk to other people, people who blog their work, or people who invest in the idea of open science, we see that, again, there isn't much evidence that this is something that's been driven by younger people. In fact, if anything, it seems to be the habitat of older researchers. We also asked them about peer review, because this obviously comes into any discussion about new forms of scholarly communications. And amongst those different grades of use, we find that there is a perception, certainly amongst frequent users, that scholarly communications will become unsustainable. Peer review will become unsustainable in the longer term, at least done by present methods. But there's no, if you like, sort of overwhelming consensus about that particular issue. And in terms of attitudes, when we talk to them, people express, some people said very enthusiastic about this. Others said, well, yes, I kind of can see that it might be something useful to do, but I don't know how it works. And that might seem a strange thing to say about something that everybody believes is very simple to use. I think what people are saying is they don't really understand the benefits of doing this. They can't work out what the connection is between putting something out into the open and the benefit to them personally as a scholar or to their community. That's the complex question that they're trying to answer. A lot of people said they didn't really have time to experiment with this because they're already too busy. And some people said, well, actually, it's really rather dangerous. It'll lead to anarchy in science, and therefore it's something we should steer well clear of. So lots of different opinions, but tending towards a rather negative attitude towards new ways of scholarly communications. But let's consider what might be driving the adoption of new forms of scholarly communications. Well, first of all, I'd like to point to an obvious suspect here, which is eResearch, and the vision that research can be conducted more quickly, faster time to discovery, become more robust and reliable, because much more material that's involved in research will become available more quickly to other people, so they can reuse it, they can test other people's research. That'll all contribute to a much more effective research process. So a recently published paper, for example, looks at the idea of the knowledge turn and how that can be accelerated so that information flows more quickly from one lab to another, and so on. And commenting that features of the social organization of scholarly communications, a tendency to keep things to yourself because you want to establish your being first in a particular field with a discovery and so forth, the practices that make them slow, scholarly communication slow, will tend to disappear, and we'll be there moving to a new world where things will work much more swiftly and effectively. Of course, the question might be, well, if that is the case, what will happen to other aspects of the scholarly communications process upon which we depend if we're going to trust it? What other aspects of the social organisation of scholarly communications might be thrown into some kind of confusion and uncertainty if we are accelerating the process of discovery and we're sharing material and ideas and results in a much more rapid fashion? So this, of course, is where peer review comes into the question, into the picture. So peer review is held to be the central mechanism that generates trust within the scholarly community, but also more widely with the public at large indeed. We know that peer review has its origins back in with the Royal Society 200-300 years ago, and it's become the cornerstone of the ways in which research is evaluated and whether it's therefore seen and understood to be of quality or otherwise, whether it's the results are sound or whether the results are simply wrong. And people say that peer review is not only important for the purposes of internally validating the quality of research, whether people can trust to reuse someone's findings, but also it's a cornerstone of how the public come to trust what scientists say. So it's important for that conversation with the public, that the public know that there is a process which is robust, which will, if not guarantee to deliver truth and honesty, at least is the best known way of doing so that we have. And Wing, in a recent paper, notes the relationship between public trust and in the integrity of science and the peer review process, pointing to a kind of, if you like, a network of relationships in the peer review process which provides the basis of public trust in science. The question being, of course, well, if peer review somehow isn't sustainable in the ways that we know and trust it, will the public trust what the science community says? Well, let's be clear that the peer review system as currently practiced is not perfect. It is well known that it has biases that, for example, exist in relation to gender. They exist in relation to institutions, so some institutions, people at some institutions get favoured over others. And therefore it can be argued it stifles innovation because only the more traditional, perhaps minded institutions will tend to get their findings out in the public domain. That it's not actually that effective in detecting errors. Lots of studies have shown that errors get through despite the use of experts. And this, of course, means that fraudulent results sometimes propagate into the community. It's slow. It's very difficult to recruit reviewers these days. If you're involved in journal editing, or indeed if you've been asked to review, I bet you find yourself having to turn down some of the requests. And there's lack of accountability because in many forms it's done without transparency, and so if you get something rejected, a paper rejected, you don't know whether it's been done because someone has a personal dislike to you or whether the comments and criticisms are justified. So it's not that we believe peer review is the best process, but perhaps it's the best that we can imagine, despite its flaws. People contest the idea whether it's sustainable in terms of, the sheer volume of reviewing that has to be done. Some people say, it's really getting to an overload limit. Other people say, well, we haven't got much evidence that that's true in our particular corner of the scientific community. And accepting all these flaws, some people are still inclined to say, well, okay, it's not perfect, but it's the best we have. No other system will be as reliable as the system as we know it now. Well, That, of course, is contested. People say, no, we've got all these different platforms. We can move peer review into a different realm. We can make it open, and hence we can radically rethink how we do it. And therefore, it means that we can transform the ways in which results are communicated to the communities and to the wider public. Experiments in doing post-publication peer review by asking for comments on papers that have been published, however, have tended to be disappointing. Nature did a trial back in 2006 and it abandoned it because it couldn't get many comments that way. And somebody commented, I noticed in the BMJ, I think it was, that cricket blogs attract lots of comments, but he can't get hardly a one for any papers on the BMJ. Some platforms are persisting with this, though. So PLOS has an open system for comments. I'm not in a position to say how successful that is, but the experiment hasn't been abandoned. But we can think of doing this in even more radically open ways. Nature's trial, after all, was done on the basis of papers that were pre-selected by the editors, and they still rejected 60% of the papers submitted. So it's hardly, if you like, a free-for-all and hardly radically open. There was still very much of a process of cut-off and quality assurance, if you like, throwing away or discarding anything which they considered to be non-scientific, didn't meet the basic criteria for a scientific paper. 60% seems a rather high figure for that, but that's the figure quoted. What we're seeing now is the emergence of platforms such as peerevaluation.org, which aims to be radically open and allow scholars to put material, papers, into the public domain such that they can be commented on by anybody. And there's no process, no gatekeeping at all to winnow out what might be considered to be unscientific. So if you go to that website, you can sign up and you can basically ask people to peer review by crowdsourcing. And the crowd will decide if your publication has merit. So this is how it's supposed to work. You put your publication up onto the platform, and then people comment on it, and you can gather the comments and you can curate them, and you can build yourself a profile, if you like, around a particular publication. And there are other players moving into this arena. So I found quite a few just by doing a fairly quick Google for open peer review. And there probably, no doubt, will be more of them in due course, which itself is a problem, because if you're a researcher, you're faced with the choice of which one to use if you want to go down that route. Now, let me finally turn to the question of impact and how to increase it, because from a researcher's point of view, that might be the motivation to move into using new forms of scholarly communications. So we have now lots of different platforms which claim to help researchers to measure their impact in new ways, go beyond the traditional citation metrics, but look at things like downloads, mentions on Twitter, mentions on blogs, and so on and so forth. So altmetrics, science card, total impact, these are platforms that claim to enable you to do that as a researcher. Reader meter, sadly, seems to be, well, yesterday anyway, was not working, so I don't know whether that's sort of gone the way of some of these platforms, is no longer working. But there are lots of choices available to you, again, if you want to measure your impact in new ways. Well, I won't dwell on those, but that's Science Card, and that's Altmetrics Manifesto, explains how you as a researcher can exploit this to measure your impact. And you can count the number of downloads, you can count the numbers of mentions on Twitter, and all these metrics can be compiled together, aggregated, such that you can present a richer picture of how valuable your research is. Now, of course, that does raise a question of how trustworthy these measures are, and I think there's an open admission here that we don't really know whether they're useful or not, but we think there might be something there, so it's worth persisting with. Question comes into this, of course, is, well, you could probably game this system if you wanted to, if you're intelligent, if you know how some of the social media platforms work, if you know how Twitter works and so forth. So there are obvious concerns about the trustworthiness of those. If you tweet your research, do you get more citations? Well, apparently you do. And this is kind of, if you like, a model of how that would work. So you should all be now tweeting your publications. Those of you who are looking down are probably doing that now. Hope you're just going to tweet this. So if you know how Twitter works, if you know how to maximize your clout, you can arguably get your research out into a wider audience, and you'll lead to more citations of your work in due course. Okay, let me finish with a couple of questions. So according to some people, research work is being part of a conversation. Okay, well, so some of the objections people raised when we talked to them were, I don't have time for this. If I did this, I wouldn't have any time to do any work. So one question is, will there be too much conversation and not enough action? I don't know if there are any Elvis fans here, but it's quite a good line. And is there the time for people to contribute, to post their reviews of other people's work in this free-for-all way? Experiments have not been very encouraging in that respect. Secondly, change is unpredictable. We don't know exactly, if we tinker with peer review, a mechanism for trust which has evolved over centuries. If we change it, we don't know exactly what world we're going to move into. And it's possible that we may not be anywhere very different from where we are now, according to this view, that actually it'll simply be to the benefit of researchers and institutions that already have a high profile in their communities. And so any thought this might sort of somehow open up the research and allow more players to take part and get credit and recognized may in fact not work out that way. I think it's a general lesson about innovation around IT that we don't necessarily get the kind of utopian world that we imagine, and actually those in a position to use the technology already in more sophisticated and powerful ways tend to get the benefits from it. So we should not be carried away by the idea that somehow this will necessarily democratize science, scholarly work, and that those institutions that enjoy a privileged status now and the researchers within them will suddenly find themselves having to compete on a more level playing field. Finally, it's risky. Peer review, as I said, has evolved over 250 years. We know its flaws, but there are risks if we tamper with it. And I think this is to do with public trust in science and whether, if peer review is radically altered, whether public will continue to trust the scientific community. One way in which I think we need to be concerned is that vested interests may be in a position to manipulate the way science results are presented if we open up the process and if we make it a free-for-all. So this was a recent article in The Guardian that talked about how science might be entering a new dark age because there are business interests in trying to subvert and create uncertainty about the science of climate change and convince the public that there's no consensus. And they're doing this by various different ways. One way they could do it, perhaps, and follow up with it in more systematic and effective ways would be to flood an open community with what might be, in fact, misleading but plausible findings. And is not having the conversation in public the price we pay for trust on the part of the public in what science does. There's an argument here that actually science works better in terms of generating trust in by the public if it does some of its work behind the scenes because the public might be quite surprised about what actually goes on within the scientific community. Now, this takes me back finally, rather neatly, I think, perhaps too neatly, to the Royal Society, which, when it was founded, held its meetings in Gresham College in London. Now, Thomas Gresham, as you may well know, is best remembered for Gresham's Law, which tells us that bad money drives out good, noting that if people suspect the currencies being adulterated, they tend to hoard their money, assuming that their collection of their coins are good, and if they exchange them, they'll get back bad coins. So they withdraw from spending their money. I wonder if something similar might happen if we open up scholarly communications in such a way that bad science will begin to flood into that space and may have a similarly debilitating and negative effect upon good science, at least from the public's perception of what is good science. And in effect, bad science will drive out good. Thank you.
Throwing out my timing all completely, so Judith, if you could set up and we'll take two questions then.
Rob, I completely agree with you about peer review. But, for example, we know anecdotally that economists blog a lot. And isn't that a good way for them to test? I mean, you present it in a kind of zero-sum way, either behind closed doors or in the open, either for academics only or for a wider public.
Yeah.
Don't we need to know, for example, how economists talk to each other on blogs, and what impact they're having on the public, and why should this be a bad thing if this is separate from the fact that economists also write peer-reviewed journals?
Well, no, I'm not saying that that we should necessarily be distracted by a polarized view. I think that we need to find a middle ground. I think it's necessary to experiment in using new forms of scholarly communications and test and see how effective they are. Measure the effects, as you suggest. And that would lead, I think, to us having sort of more guidance and understanding about how we can then move into this new world, and yet, while preserving the features of the old that we believe to be important. So, yes, we need to experiment. It's not simply staying with the old methods and rejecting entirely the new opportunities, but I think we've got to do more experimentation to find out what the real value and the real worth of these new forms of scholarly communications are, and to provide guidelines so people can use them effectively.